Good morning.
Morning.
It's a different place. It's like so big. I'll try to make sure I speak loudly for it. We're going to start with a scripture reading from the book of Hebrews, chapter 7. We're going to read verses 26 to 28. So Hebrews chapter 7, starting in verse 26. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priest men in all their weaknesses, but the oath, which came after the law, appointed the Son, who has been made perfect forever. My day job is a structural engineer. So one thing that I do sometimes is design temporary supports. So right now we have a project where it's a big tank. It holds a bunch of liquids. The roof is all corroded out. It's all rusted away, so it's about to collapse in. So we have to replace the roof. So what we want to do is put in temporary columns, kind of replace the roof, and then put in a permanent column so everything would be supported. And the idea behind the temporary supports is just so it's for now, just during construction. You know, it's kind of a temporary thing. So because of that, it's designed with a slightly smaller factor of safety. You know, the chances of it failing during that period of time are a little bit less, so you can design it with a little bit more, excuse me, a little bit more leniency, I suppose. And the permanent ones are the ones that are good for the design life of the structure. So, you know, we put in the temporary ones, then we put in the permanent one, then we take the temporary ones out, and the permanent one lasts forever, essentially. Forever in quotes, you know, design life. Things always kind of, you know, break down over time. In the similar way, that's the way the Old Testament priests were in the Old Testament under the old law. God appointed the Old Testament priests by command, knowing that they were a temporary thing. He knew he had this plan in place, knowing that this Levitical priesthood was only going to last for a period of time, and then a permanent priesthood was going to put into place. This Levitical priesthood was a shadow of what was to come. We talked about that last lesson, this idea of shadow and type, a pattern. Those phrases or those words are used in the New Testament referring back to the Old Testament, showing how the old law was a pattern of what was to come. It was something that was similar to, but not exactly the thing that was going to come. The same way your shadow on the ground is an impression of yourself, but it's not yourself. God knew that a permanent priesthood was going to come. He predicted that in Psalm 110 and verse 4. When he said, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." This is in the Old Testament. This is before Jesus came. And he's predicting that this permanent priesthood is going to come. It says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind." This priest is going to come. You're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So this Levitical priesthood was good for a time, but God knew that it was temporary. And Jesus' priesthood is the permanent one, and that's the one that's going to last forever. We've been going through chapter 7 of the book of Hebrews, and we're now at the end of chapter 7 in the last passage of that chapter. And it's a summary that shows how Jesus' priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood in every way. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to go through this summary to really show and really drive home this point. This whole chapter has been building up to this and showing the aspects of how Jesus' priesthood is superior, and then he kind of summarizes it in this last portion of chapter 7. Really, the book of Hebrews as a whole is discussing this idea of Jesus' priesthood being superior and the new covenant being superior to the old covenant. Again, the immediate audience of the book of Hebrews is Jewish Christians. They're people who are raised under the old law. And we can learn from this as well as we study the book of Hebrews. And it's really showing that supremacy of this new covenant. The new covenant's coming in. It's the permanent one. The old law was one that was just a shadow, a pattern of what was to come. And now we have what is to come. This is the permanent one. All the way through Hebrews, this is repeated and taught. Hebrews chapter 1 talked about how Jesus was superior to the Old Testament prophets. Again, in Hebrews chapter 1 and chapter 2, it starts to talk about how Jesus was superior to the angels and is superior to the angels. Hebrews chapter 3 talks about how Jesus is superior to Moses. And in chapter 5 and what we've been looking at in chapter 7, it's showing how Jesus is superior to Aaron and the Levitical priesthood, and therefore setting aside that old law. This idea and this way of showing the superiority of Jesus' priesthood is done in a step-by-step process, as we see as we go through the book of Hebrews. It shows how Jesus is qualified by priest by virtue of his calling by God and his suffering in chapter 5. Chapter 5 also, and in chapter 7 as well, he's been called as a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And in chapter 7, a couple of lessons ago, we saw how this priestly order of Melchizedek is shown to be superior by comparing Abraham to Melchizedek, showing how Melchizedek was superior to Abraham. And then it carries on with Christ as our high priest. Since he's in the order of Melchizedek, he's also superior to Abraham and to the old law. The Levitical priesthood could not make one perfect. We looked at how being perfect, the idea of that word perfect is complete. We can have that complete relationship with God. We can have that perfect relationship with God that's no longer hindered by our sin because of Jesus' sacrifice. And the law on which the Levitical priesthood was based has now been set aside. We're no longer under the old law anymore. And Christ now provides a better hope, one which we can draw near to God. We can now have that perfect relationship with God. So it's a buildup all the way through the book of Hebrews. And now at the end of chapter 7, he really summarizes how Jesus is superior in all ways to the Levitical priesthood. And again, that's what we're going to look at. We're going to see in 4 points that illustrate Jesus' superiority to the Levitical priesthood. The first one, we're going to back up a little bit from our scripture reading. Hebrews chapter 7. We'll look at verses 20 to 22. In this passage, the first point showing Jesus' superiority is that Jesus has a divine appointment. He's appointed by God as our high priest. Hebrews 7, verses 20 to 22. And it was not without an oath. Other became priests without any oath. But he became priest with an oath when God said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant. Hold your bookmark in chapter 7 of Hebrews, but we'll go back to the Old Testament. Let's go to Exodus chapter 28. Levitical priests were appointed by command. So they were commanded. This is a position that they should have held. But just like I have temporary columns in structures that I design sometimes, this is one thing where it's a temporary thing, and it's understood that it was a temporary thing. But it was something that was commanded by God to have Levitical priests. Exodus chapter 28, and we'll look at verses 1 and 2. It's Exodus 28, starting in verse 1. Have Aaron, your brother, brought to you from among the Israelites, along with his sons Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar, so they may serve me as priests. Make sacred garments for your brother Aaron to give him dignity and honor. Aaron and his sons, the Levitical priesthood, was something that was divinely commanded. God commanded them to be priests. But although they were commanded by God to be priests, it was not with an oath. It wasn't accompanied with an oath. And that's what makes Jesus' priesthood special. We go to Psalm 110 and verse 4. We look again at this passage that prophesies that this new priesthood is going to come in the order of Melchizedek. In this passage, it shows how God swore an oath concerning the coming Messiah and his priesthood. So Psalm 110 and verse 4. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So the Lord has sworn. He swore an oath. He's somebody who God has said, this is what's going to happen, and I confirm this with an oath. It's something that really confirms the unchangeableness of God's instruction in this case. We go back to Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 17. It touches on this idea of an oath accompanying Jesus' appointment as our high priest. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 17. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. So God wanted us to be very sure that Jesus is our high priest. He's the permanent high priest. The Levitical priesthood was something that was necessary at the time. It's a pattern of what to come. It's something that's similar to what is going to come. and it was divinely appointed by God. But Jesus was appointed a high priest by an oath. He had a divine oath saying, this is our high priest. It's permanent. It's not going to change. It's forever. It says here in verse 17, he wanted the unchanging of nature of his purpose very clear. He wanted to really drive it home to us. This isn't going to change. So he confirmed it with an oath. I like in this passage too, where he says he wanted to make this unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised. That's us. He's promising it to us, making sure that we recognize that Jesus is our high priest, and confirming it with an oath, saying that yes, this is the permanent thing. This is the thing that's going to last forever. If we continue on in this passage in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 20 and 22, verse 22, it says, because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant. So he's appointed by oath and not just a command. So it's really driving it home that he's our permanent high priest. And now he's a guarantor of a better covenant. Depending on your version, it might say a surety of a better covenant. Surety is not as much of a common word, at least in my experience used today. But the idea is of guaranteeing something. I guarantee this is going to happen. Surety is also used a lot of the time in the idea of co-signing for somebody. You know, if you want to allow somebody to get a loan, but they don't qualify to the bank, you know, for whatever reason, you can go in as yourself and you can say, okay, I'm going to back this person up and say that they're going to pay. If they don't pay, I'm going to pay. So maybe not the wisest financial advice in our society sometimes, depending on the people you do this with. But that's the idea behind it, is Jesus is the guarantor of our better covenant. We can rely on Jesus. He's the one standing up for us. He's the one saying that, you know, I'm standing up for these people who are obedient to me. This is the better covenant that we have. He's interceding for us in heaven. And he's standing up for us. He guarantees this new covenant. He guarantees that we can have that perfect relationship with God. And he's guaranteeing that this covenant is better or superior than the old law. Again, back to that idea of convincing these Jewish Christians that this book is immediately being written to, saying this law that you've been raised up throughout your whole life, we now have the permanent better one in place, and Jesus is guaranteeing this as our perfect high priest. We're in Hebrews chapter 7. Let's continue on to verses 23 to 25. We'll look at another illustration to show how Jesus' priesthood is superior. Hebrews 7, verses 23 to 25. Now there have been many of those priests, since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. The Levitical priests, again, this comparison and showing how Jesus' priesthood is superior. The Levitical priests were limited in service by death. They were human people. They were people who lived and also passed away. So when one died, another one took his place. And out of necessity, there had to be many priests because of that. You know, throughout the years, you know, more and more priests would, pass on, and then other ones would take their place. But Jesus, in this passage, we see that he always lives. He lives forever to intercede for us. If we go back up a few verses to Hebrews 7 and verse 16, we see how Jesus became a high priest according to the power of an endless life. And Jesus is superior because he does live forever, and he's always going to intercede for us. Hebrews 7 and verse 16. One who has become a high priest, not on the basis of regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. Jesus is a high priest not because he's a Levitical, from the Levite genealogy, from that line. He's from the tribe of Judah. He is appointed by God into this position, and he is a high priest on the basis of the power of his indestructible life. He's going to live forever. And in verse 25 of Hebrews chapter 7, he has this permanent priesthood, and therefore he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Jesus could do what the old law could not do. If we go to Hebrews 7 and verse 19, the old law could not make somebody perfect. Again, last week we talked about this idea of perfection and being perfect, being complete, having that complete relationship with God. And the old law could not do this. Hebrews 7 and verse 19. For the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced, by which we draw near to God. Jesus has the ability as our high priest to make us perfect and have that relationship with God. And he always does it. It's something that doesn't end. It's an eternal intercession for us. It's something that's always in place. The Levitical priests lived and passed on. They were always replaced, but Jesus is going to live forever and always be that intercessor for us. Let's go to a different passage in the New Testament, Colossians chapter 1. This is a passage that really describes how we have that relationship with God because Jesus is interceding for us. Colossians 1, we'll look at verses 21 and 22. So Colossians 1, starting in verse 21. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Holy and blameless in God's sight is that perfect state that Christ can achieve for us under this new covenant. It's something that we can have. We can have that holy and blameless. We can have that relationship with God because we have Jesus interceding for us and interceding forever. He always lives. He lives forever. He's always going to be in that place for anyone who wants to accept the gift of salvation. Anybody can have this relationship with God through this new covenant. Whereas compared to the Old Testament, that's something that wasn't possible. It was a pattern, just simply a shadow of what was to come. And now we have in place what is to come. Back to Hebrews 7 and verse 25. This is how this short passage ends, where it says in verse 25, because he always lives to intercede for them. Jesus is not limited by death like the Old Testament priests were. He always lives, and that makes him our permanent priest who lives to intercede forever. And in that way, Jesus is superior. His priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood. As we continue on to verses 26 and 27 of chapter 7, we see another contrast here between the Old Testament priests and Jesus as our high priest. This one shows Jesus' perfect character. Hebrews 7, verses 26 and 27. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. Levitical priests were sinners just like every other human in the world. They had to offer sacrifices day after day, first for their own sins and then for the sins of the people. That's listed under the old law. They had to offer those sacrifices for their sins, and then they were, kind of able to offer those sacrifices for the sins of a people as well. It had to be done daily because we're continually sinning. We're continuing to make mistakes. And again, continually doing it for themselves and for others as well. But Jesus, again, in this contrast between the Levitical priests who were humans, who made mistakes, who were flawed, Jesus is holy, blameless, and pure, set apart from sinners. Jesus, as our high priest, has a holy character. He's somebody who is different than every other human. He also has a preeminent position. He's exalted above the heavens, as we see in this passage. So he does not need to offer sacrifices for himself, just like the Old Testament priests did. Because Jesus and his character, because he is holy and blameless, he doesn't have to do that. He doesn't have to offer those sacrifices for himself first and then for the sins of the people. Jesus is a high priest with a perfect, holy, divine character. So that makes him superior to the Levitical high priests as well. We get to Hebrews 7 and verse 27. We'll look at the last reason here, or the last attribute or illustration that shows how Jesus is superior to the Levitical high priests. The idea here is his permanent sacrifice, a sacrifice that does not have to be repeated over and over again. Hebrews 7 and verse 27. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. Again, the Levitical priests offered sacrifices daily on a regular basis. They'd offer them for their own sins, for the sins of the people. And since they had to be continually offered over and over and over again, really shows that fundamental weakness in the effectiveness of the Old Testament sacrifices. It shows that they are just simply a pattern or a shadow of what was to come, the perfect thing which is to come. If you go ahead to chapter 10 and verse 4, we've looked at this passage before, but it really shows the inability for these animal sacrifices to make somebody perfect and cleanse our sins. Hebrews 10 and verse 4. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. It's very clear. It very clearly shows how the Old Testament sacrifices were a temporary thing. They were there just as a pattern or a shadow to show what was to come. And it's something that is impossible for them to take away those sins. The blood of bulls and goats cannot take away those sins. But if we go to Hebrews 7 and verse 27, it shows here that Jesus offered himself once for all when he offered himself. Jesus offered himself as that perfect sacrifice. When he offered himself on the cross, he was that perfect sacrifice that only needed to be offered once. It doesn't have to be repeated. It's a perfect sacrifice. Levitical sacrifices under the old law had to be repeated over and over again because it was impossible for those to cleanse our conscience of sin. But Jesus, when his body was crucified and his blood shed, which we remembered today on the first day of the week when we partook of the Lord's Supper, his sacrifice paid for all those sins that we have made. And again, it's a very personal thing. It's something that, you make a mistake, and we know that Jesus, in his perfect sacrifice, he's continually in heaven interceding for us, and it's because of his sacrifice he paid for those sins that we made. He paid for our sins, the mistakes that we've made. Verse 28, we see the conclusion of the whole chapter. So Hebrews 7 and verse 28. For the law appoints as high priests men in all their weaknesses, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever. Here we have the summary statement that really contrasts those two priesthoods. We have a reference to the law. The law appoints high priests as men in all their weaknesses. The law is where the Levitical priesthood derived all of its authority. And again, the people that are immediately reading this passage, these Jewish Christians, that's what they grew up with. They see how this Levitical priesthood and the law, the Old Testament law, that's what they knew. That's what all that they did was based on. But all of that thing, or everything that this law was based on, has weaknesses. The Levitical priests were sinners themselves. Death terminates their services. Their sacrifices could not truly remove sin. So they had to be repeated daily and yearly, over and over again, for the priests themselves and also for the people. There's reference here in this passage to the oath, which is given after the law and is the basis of Christ's priesthood. And it appoints the Son who has been made perfect forever. Jesus' humanity and the obedience learned through his suffering, through his time on this earth, makes him the most fitting for our high priest. He is the one who is the best person for as our high priest. And his sinlessness makes the sacrifice of himself the perfect and all-sufficient sacrifice that was made. It's given once for all, not repeated like the Old Testament sacrifices. So we've seen in these passages what makes Jesus our perfect high priest. His appointment is by oath from God, not just a command, but it's an oath saying, yes, Jesus is our permanent high priest. It's not going to change, and we can rely on that as heirs of the promise. He has an eternal intercession for us. He's always in heaven. He's always at the right hand of God interceding for us. He's the guarantor for us. He's the one saying that this covenant is the new covenant. I guarantee it. I'm always in heaven and I'm always going to intercede for you. He's not limited by death. He has a perfect character. He's untainted by sin. He's lived a life that was sinless on this earth, the only human who's ever done so. And his sacrifice is a permanent one. It's once for all when he offered himself. It does not have to be repeated like the Old Testament law. So we can see how Jesus is our perfect high priest. And he is greater than the Levitical high priests, the ones that were instituted and commanded to be in that position under the old law. So wouldn't you want to have Jesus as your high priest interceding on your behalf? We'd like to offer that invitation. If you've not yet accepted Jesus on as your Lord, we can show you in the scriptures how to accept this gift. Again, this thing is something that's offered to everybody on the world. Jesus sacrificed himself not just for people who are obedient to him, he offered himself for everybody on the earth. And everybody has the ability to accept this gift and have Jesus as their high priest, interceding for them for all time. So if you have that desire, we can show you in the scriptures how to do that. And if you are somebody who's struggling in any way, again, please make your needs known, and we'd love to help in any way that we can.